Senior researcher? Vethnora pressed her four-fingered hands against the observation glass and watched the humans below with growing confusion. The research station orbited Earth's moon and had been collecting data for nearly 3 standard cycles. In all that time, she still could not understand what she was seeing. The humans were arguing again. 2 groups stood on opposite sides of a public square in one of their major cities. They held signs. They shouted words that the translation matrix identified as deeply insulting. Some of them looked ready to fight. Vethnora had seen this pattern hundreds of times now. What happened next was the part that broke every model the collective had ever developed about intelligent species. After 3 hours of shouting, the humans simply went home. The next morning, they returned to their shared workplaces. They sat in the same eating establishments. Their children attended the same learning centers. The society did not collapse. The species did not split into separate factions that waged eternal war. It was impossible. Yet it kept happening. Vethnora turned to her research assistant, a young male named Kortal. He was reviewing the day's data on his tablet, and his face showed the same confusion that lived permanently in her thoughts now. The Galactic Collective had sent them here after first contact with humanity revealed something deeply strange. Human society was fractured in ways that should have destroyed them long ago. They disagreed about everything: politics, religion, economics, social structures. Even basic facts about their own history sparked violent debates among them. The collective had encountered hundreds of intelligent species across the galaxy. Every single one had solved the problem of social cohesion in the same basic way. Either a species agreed on fundamental values and organized around them, or the species split into separate groups that no longer interacted. Sometimes those groups went to war and only one survived. Sometimes they simply moved apart and built separate civilizations. Humans did neither. They lived together while disagreeing about almost everything that should have mattered. They called it democracy. They called it pluralism. They called it freedom of thought. Vethnora called it a mystery that kept her awake during rest cycles. The research facility had brought together the finest minds from 12 different species. All of them had spent their careers studying social dynamics. All of them had arrived confident that they would crack the human puzzle within a few months. 3 years later, they had more questions than answers. Kortal looked up from his tablet. His voice carried the tone of someone reporting something they did not believe. He told Vethnora that the humans in the Western continent had just completed another election cycle. The losing faction had accepted the results. They were not happy about it. They were already planning to compete again in the next cycle, but they had accepted it. Vethnora asked how close the vote had been. Kortal checked his data. The difference was less than 2% of the population. Half the species had wanted one leader. Half had wanted another. Yet they were all going to live under the winner's leadership anyway. This was the part that made other species fear humans. Not their physical abilities, not their weapons. Their complete immunity to the social fracturing that should have destroyed them. The collective's models said that any species with this level of disagreement should have torn itself apart centuries ago. Humans just kept going. The door to the observation chamber opened, and research director Meln Sith entered. She was from a species that had achieved perfect social harmony by eliminating individual disagreement entirely. Her people found the concept of arguing about fundamental values to be physically uncomfortable. She had requested assignment to this facility specifically because she believed her perspective would help solve the puzzle. Instead, it had given her chronic headaches. She announced that the Central Collective wanted another progress report. The leadership was getting impatient. Other species were starting to notice Earth. The collective needed to understand humans before others tried to make contact. An approach that worked with every other species might trigger some unknown response in these strange creatures. Vethnora understood the pressure. She shared it. But understanding humans was proving harder than mapping new star systems. She asked Mounseth to give her another 30 rotations. She believed they were close to something important. The truth was more complicated. Vesnora was not close to answers, but she had developed a theory. It was a wild theory. Her colleagues would probably reject it. But after 3 years of observation, it was the only explanation that fit the data. She believed that human disagreement was not a weakness. It was their greatest strength, their fundamental survival mechanism, the thing that had allowed them to dominate their planet and reach for the stars, while other Earth species remained trapped in simple survival patterns. The theory had come to her while watching a human research team work on a problem. The team contained 8 individuals with 8 different opinions about the solution. They had argued constantly. Sometimes the arguments had become personal. 2 of them had stopped speaking to each other for 3 days. Then they had solved the problem. The solution had contained elements from 5 different approaches. None of them could have reached it alone. The argument itself had been the process. The friction between ideas had generated something new. Vesnora had started seeing this pattern everywhere once she knew to look for it. Human art, human science, human governance, human relationships. Everything worked through conflict. They tested ideas by smashing them against other ideas. The weak parts broke away. The strong parts combined into something better. Other species achieved progress through harmony. They gathered together, found agreement, and moved forward as one. Humans achieved progress through controlled chaos. They fought about everything while somehow maintaining enough connection to keep functioning as a species. The key word was controlled. That was what Vesnora still did not fully understand. How did humans keep their conflicts from destroying them? What invisible force held them together when every surface indicator said they should fly apart? She had devoted the last 6 months to finding the answer. She had studied human families that contained members with opposing political beliefs. She had analyzed human friendships that survived fundamental religious differences. She had examined human institutions that had lasted centuries despite constant internal warfare. The patterns were starting to emerge. Humans had developed complex systems for managing disagreement, rules about how to fight, shared values about the process of conflict, even when they disagreed about outcomes, deep beliefs about the rights of their opponents to exist and participate. They had a word for it: tolerance. It did not mean they agreed with each other. It meant they had decided that disagreement was acceptable, that different beliefs could exist in the same space, that the person they were arguing with today might be their ally tomorrow on a different issue. This was revolutionary thinking for the collective. Other species operated on the assumption that disagreement was a problem to be solved. Humans had decided that disagreement was a feature to be managed. They had built their entire civilization around the idea that they would never agree and that this was somehow fine. Vesnora had begun writing her preliminary report. She knew it would cause controversy. She was essentially arguing that the collective's entire approach to social organization might be suboptimal. Thousands of years of galactic civilization were based on the idea that harmony was the goal. Humans suggested that productive conflict might actually work better. The evidence was hard to deny. Human technological progress was faster than any species the collective had encountered. Their rate of innovation was almost frightening. New ideas emerged from their constant arguments like sparks from a fire. Most of those ideas failed, but the ones that survived were refined by the process of debate into something remarkable. Kortal interrupted her thoughts. He had found something in the data that he wanted her to see. A human city had just experienced a natural disaster. Buildings had fallen. Lives had been lost. The emergency was still ongoing. Vesnora watched the video feeds with growing amazement. Humans who had been arguing with each other hours before were now working side by side. Political enemies were pulling each other from rubble. People who disagreed about everything were suddenly united in shared purpose. The divisions that had seemed so important had vanished in moments. This was the final piece of the puzzle. Humans did not just tolerate disagreement. They had learned to separate disagreement from their fundamental bonds. They could hate someone's ideas while still recognizing them as family, as neighbors, as fellow humans. The arguments were on the surface. Something deeper held them together underneath. It was identity. Humans had constructed a shared identity that transcended their disagreements. They were human first. Everything else was secondary. When true crisis came, that identity rose to the surface and the arguments fell away. Then, when the crisis passed, the arguments returned. The cycle continued forever. Vethnora finally understood. Human society did not maintain cohesion despite their disagreements. It maintained cohesion through their disagreements. The conflicts were constantly testing and reinforcing the boundaries of their shared identity. Every argument that did not destroy them made the underlying bond stronger. She began writing faster. The collective needed to know this. Humans were not a broken species struggling to survive their own contradictions. They were a species that had evolved to use contradiction as fuel. Their chaos was their order. Their division was their unity. Other species would have to be warned. Traditional approaches to human contact would not work. Demanding that humans agree on things before negotiation could proceed would be seen as an attack on their basic nature. Trying to exploit their divisions would backfire spectacularly. Their divisions were not weaknesses. They were the source of their adaptability. Research Director Mounsith returned to check on progress. Vethnora shared her theory. She expected skepticism. Instead, Mounsith was silent for a long time. Then she admitted that it explained something that had been bothering her. Human ambassadors never seemed to speak for their entire species. They always qualified their statements. They acknowledged that others of their kind might disagree. Mounsith had assumed this was weakness. Now she realized it was honesty. No human could speak for all humans because all humans never agreed. Their ambassadors were simply acknowledging reality. The report took another 10 rotations to complete. Vethnora included all her data, all her observations, all the patterns she had found. The conclusion was simple but profound. Humanity had solved a problem that no other known species had solved. They had learned to disagree without dying. They had built a civilization on the principle that conflict was natural and manageable. They had turned their greatest apparent weakness into their greatest actual strength. The galactic collective would need to adapt its models. Humans were not waiting to be unified. They never would be unified. And that was exactly what made them so remarkable. The research facility continued its observations. The data kept flowing. Down on Earth, humans kept arguing about everything. And somehow, impossibly, they kept moving forward together. Vethnora watched them with something that felt almost like admiration. She came from a species that had eliminated disagreement. They had achieved peace, but they had also stopped evolving. New ideas were rare among her people now. Why think differently when everyone already agreed? Humans would never have that problem. Their beautiful, chaotic, impossible disagreement would drive them forward forever. The universe had never seen anything quite like them. And Vethnora suspected that the universe was not ready for what they would become.